Okay? And the way they do that, which if I teach a course on money and banking sometime here, well, I'll be glad to go through with you, but the way they do that has the effect of moving interest rates up and down. So that gives them yet another way to manipulate the economy. Simplest way to summarize all this, the Federal Reserve is the agency of the government that manipulates, and I use that word carefully, the money supply in the United States. How much money there is, and on what terms can you borrow or not borrow that money. The point of it is to make sure the economy avoids a collapse by coming in and manipulating the money system to avoid that, if you can, to reverse it when you can. And likewise, if things are spinning out of control with prices going crazy and inflation, they're supposed to come in and manipulate the money supply to fix that problem. They're a fixing agency. To monitor, to control, and to fix. That's what they do. That's what they're there to do. The government manipulates the monetary system, the monetary structure of the country. That's what every central bank in every country does. The Bank of China does it there, the Bank of France does it in Paris, etc. So that's what we do. It includes manipulating the value of our currency relative to other currencies. That's the particular task of the New York Federal Reserve Bank. But that's what that is. Okay? It's an agency to manipulate the money system. Yeah.
So what has the Fed done with quantitative easing?
Quantitative easing, which they've been, what?
I don't want you to be too deflected from the papers that were revealed.
Okay, I'm going to come back to it, but it's good to answer the questions too. And other people, I can see people nodding, so people have this way. Quantitative easing is America. Quantitative easing is what Americans do when they're upset with the reality. They change the name. If you're not happy as a bus driver, you are now a transportation engineer. You feel a lot better. Okay? We don't print money, we quantitatively ease. Okay. That's all that is. Quantitative easing is increasing the money supply. That's all it is. Just another way of saying, yeah.
Is it not true that the Federal Reserve is a private institution?
It's half private, it's half public.
I mean, these banks, these large banks have stock in those, in that banking system, and every transaction that takes place, they extract some interest out of the transactions. Is that not so, or
They have
far afield?
It's close. Banks have deposits at the Federal Reserve.
Right.
One of the rules of banks,
Big
the
banks.
Federal Reserve, all banks have to have reserves against, you can't lend out all the deposits to make life simple. You have to keep a reserve. So for every dollar you get in deposit, you're allowed roughly in this country now to lend out about 80 cents. The other 20 cents you have to keep on reserve. The way you do that is you maintain a deposit for your bank at the Federal Reserve. That allows it to monitor, to control, and so forth. But the president names Mr. Bernanke, so the person who makes the decisions is a political appointee, not an appointee of the banks. Now, typically it's done in conjunction with the banks, and it's a kind of a partnership. But notice about the Federal Reserve. When they make a decision about the quantity of money, do they have to get the approval of the president? No. Do they have to get the approval of the Congress for what they do? No. Do they have to get the approval of the Supreme Court? No. Do they have to get anybody's approval? No. They sit around, these 12 people, and they decide how much money there's going to be. Not a minor matter in a society that's capitalistic, as you might have noticed. The reason they have given this extraordinary independence is because of the history of governments, whenever they've been in trouble anywhere in the history of the world, using the power of printing money to try to get out of their dilemma. And in the process, making that money too plentiful, worthless, driving prices up and so forth. And nobody trusts the politicians, so since you have to have the government control it, because nobody trusts the private banks, but you can't put it in the hands of the politicians because you don't trust them, you create this peculiar, quasi-independent thing, and you hope like hell that that's more trustworthy than the alternatives, which it rarely turns out to be. Meaning that you've got what people in another tradition might call an internal contradiction of capitalism. It can't manage its monetary affairs, and if you doubt that, look around. Look at what's happening here. Now we get back to the revelations. We saw one more footnote about the question. On the left in the United States, there is, as there is on the right, and for that matter in the middle, there is a tendency to look for and find the bad guys, the conspirators who are nastily doing the dirty deeds. I understand them. I enjoy looking and finding and pointing the finger at them too. But I don't think that's the way to go here. If you punish all of the nasty people at the top of the banking system for all the nasty things they did, and I certainly would support it, what would you get? You throw them all in jail, and the next crop of bankers, being caught in the exact same system that the first group, will do the same thing. You haven't changed the rules. The bankers do what the banking system pressures them to do. They'll be the first one to explain that to you. If we didn't do it, then we would have lost the competitive situation. We had to do it. Did we worry about it? Yes, but everybody else would. It's the same. If you don't change the system, then you're going to repeat the problem. Everybody was doing what they were supposed to do. Everybody was trying to make it work. Were they cutting corners? Sure they were. The only people who don't cheat in this society are the folks gathered in this room. Everybody else is busy doing it. And you occasionally worry, don't you? That since everybody else is doing it, why actually aren't you also doing it? And some of you don't resolve that question in the way that your mother would have preferred. Right? So in fact, everybody plays these games. If you don't want the outcome, you got to change the game. But going after the particular, these people did a bad thing. Yeah, they did. But so did they, and so did they, and so did they. And they did it for the reason that this system forces it. So if you don't deal with that, you're not going to solve the problem. I think that the way to see it, the crisis, it's a crisis of a system, not the crisis of this, that, or the other part of the system. But it's very tempting to get angry at an institution like the Federal Reserve. Throughout the history of the crises of capitalism, there have always been movements of people on the left and the right who have fastened on somebody who's the bad guy, developed a theory of their evil, their conspiracy, their self-serving. Were they people doing things for their own personal reasons? Of course. Were the banks making sure that things go well for them ahead of everybody else? Absolutely. That's how the system works. If you don't want them to behave that way, you've got to change a lot more than who's the head of the bank. It's just not going to solve your problem, however much pleasure you get by seeing somebody carted off to jail. Okay? It's personal judgment, but I think it follows from the situation that we're facing. So the Federal Reserve revealed all of these loans and left a lot of questions unanswered about exactly why these people got loans. But you couldn't but walk away from the list and the enormous sums of money. You couldn't walk away without at least this insight, no matter what your politics were. The United States government sustained for months on end all of the major players in the financial sector of the United States. They were defunct. They were broken. They were bankrupt. They were out of business. They were losing propositions. The government made them whole. It did it in a whole bunch of ways, but even just the part that the Federal Reserve did, which was only a part, the United States Treasury played just as important a part. But what the Federal Reserve did alone makes it a joke to talk about whatever you want about the American economy as being the achievement of or the success of the private sector or private enterprise. Private sector, private enterprise collapsed. And the United States government showed itself remarkably adept at pouring an enormous amount of money in to make these banks whole again, to make them function, to make them lend at least enough to prevent the collapse that they did believe, and I think had a good reason to believe, was about to unfold on them. But it is worth going to take a few minutes and looking at who you might be surprised that who got money. Yeah.
Just since the banks were not nationalized, does that not bring up the issue that the country is oligarchical? Does that have a connection between that? I mean, because if they were bankrupt, as most people who foreclosed on, lost their homes when they became foreclosed. However, the idea or the concept of too big to fail lends itself to me to suspect that it's oligarchical interest that's maintaining the system as it is to be a factor of giving those who had, the bankers who had squandered their money, be allowed to go forth on taxpayer money and taxpayers not receive any return for that.
I think you're right.
Am I clear?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think you're clear. I think you're right. I would put it slightly differently. I think it is the power of ideology in the United States, the power of our culture, that made it not only possible, but kind of automatic, that when these private banks threatened to go down and take the whole economy with them, that the government said, okay, what we clearly must do is get them functioning again. We must help them. We must give them the wherewithal to resume their function as private capitalists.